It's Thursday, July 28th, 2016. We are just 2 days shy of Seahawks training camp as I record this. This is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, the post-Reel on the Field Goals podcast after Danny Kelly left to the Ringer, if you're just tuning in for the first time. And we're just going to keep on doing the same thing. It's just going to be chats about the Seahawks and anything else that may come up during that time, and just continue to talk to knowledgeable people within the team atmosphere. And as such is Stephen Cohen of the Seattle PI, a regular on Reel on the Field Goals and a first-timer on Seaside Chats, a man who, if I recall correctly, kept tally of the number of times he was on Reel on the Field Goals. And so, Stephen, you're all tied up 1-1-1 with guests on Seaside Chats. So, goals to strive for coming up.
As long as I stay even with or ahead of Condota, I'm good. That's all I really care about.
I think you can get there. I think you're going to have the inside track on that one. But yeah, there's so much to talk about with the Seattle Seahawks this week, not just leading up to Saturday's first day of training camp, but the last few days. This whole week has been jam-packed with late July news. The first coming with the extension announcement for John Schneider to stay with the team, and then 2 days later, as expected, though definitely not guaranteed, a 3-year extension for head coach Pete Carroll. How important was it for them to get these deals done before training camp?
I think it was a big deal, if only for the fact that they didn't want to be answering the same questions over and over and over again about their deals. We started asking Pete, I think, about his contract status because he's available to us regularly at the end of last season, and he just wasn't interested in discussing it at all. Kind of always brushed it off, and you could tell it was good-natured and stuff, and it wasn't like he had bad feelings about it, but he just did not want to talk about it. So the fact that it's done, it's in the rearview mirror now, I think is a big deal for both of them. They can kind of get to work, focus on what they want to focus on, and not have to deal with kind of the distraction of a contract negotiation. It's a little bit like what we saw last year with Russell Wilson, where heading into training camp, we all kind of assumed if it didn't get done then, it was going to get pushed off until, if at any time. And I think that's a little bit what we were seeing with Pete and John. If they hadn't gotten done, I don't know if they would have negotiated through the season because it's just, there's too much to do. And so I think it's a big deal to kind of sew it up now.
There's been some talk and speculation about the difference in years and why they wouldn't keep the same two guys who have worked so well together around for the same number of years, John Schneider getting more than Pete Carroll. Do you make anything of that, or is it just because Pete Carroll may have just be closer to, retirement? He is 20 years older.
Yeah, we asked Schneider about that today in the meeting we had with him, and he said there's nothing to it. So the only thing that I can attribute that to is Pete's age and the fact that this might be his last NFL contract. He's 64. He'll be 68, I think, by the time the deal is done. And, they probably didn't feel the need to sign anything longer because those coaching contracts are guaranteed, too. It's like you pay them whether or not the person's there to earn the pay. So if he only thought this is kind of how long he wanted to go, I think that's what they were doing. So I think that's the only conclusion we can draw from that.
Do you think that Pete Carroll, he seems like the type that's not even going to address the topic of retirement until the day that he retires? Is that sort of is that what you gather from the talks that you've had with him or the press conferences, that it's like, look, we're not going to talk about retirement. I'm only 64. People retire in their 70s now, so it's like there's nothing to necessarily make out of it. He's not the type to look ahead to that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I think so. If they win another Super Bowl this year or in the next couple of years, I think you will have the questions, at least, because everybody loves that storyline of kind of walking out on top and Super Bowl title, which I think would give him a real strong resume for the Hall of Fame. That'll come up, and I think he'll probably blow off those questions like he kind of blew off the questions about the extension. Like, until he's there, he's not going to talk about it, and probably won't talk about it for long. because the guy's just about football. You know what I mean? Like he has kind of a single track mindset when he is in his role there about working with this team and doing whatever he can to win. So, I don't anticipate him to be like, I think when he decides, he'll decide. He'll just walk away. But I don't think we'll know that until he does that. I don't think we'll get tipped on that at all.
Just speaking of, into the training camp, which starts on Saturday, July 30th, and then going on from there and then leading into the preseason. Obviously, one of the main jobs at the PI, it just says at Field Goals or anywhere else, would be talking about the storylines that jump out, And so what are the storylines? What is the biggest thing that people are going to be looking at or should be looking for in these first few days or first few weeks of training camp?
Well, I think the big one is the one that is going to be boring because we've been talking about it kind of ad nauseum since last year, but it's the offensive line. I think that given the fact that you might have 5 new starters, and as of right now, that's who was running with, the first team was new starters at every single position. Given the fact that their struggles last year, the fact that they had to kind of change things up midway through camp last year because they really didn't like headed. I think we're all going to be watching that line to see, who's in the positions, for the starting team, but then also how fluid those are. If it becomes clear that there are 5 guys they like together and they want to get them as many reps as possible together, I think that is a good sign for the Seahawks. If we see guys rotating in and out, we see at center, and then we see Patrick Lewis at center, and then we see Joey Hunt at center. Team, I think that would be a cause for alarm from Seahawks fans. It'd be interesting to us reporting on the team, but I think that would be a red flag that they are still kind of grasping at straws there with the line. So I think that's the biggest one. The position battles, maybe some more interesting ones that we've seen on this team from years prior, like a starting linebacker spot. A starting spot on this defense without a real favorite for the first time in just 2012, really, at the Sam linebacker spot, where you've got 4 guys: Mike Morgan, Cassius Marsh, Eric Pinkins, Kevin Pierre-Louis, all trying to replace Bruce Irvin, and I don't think there's a real favorite right now. So that one's going to be interesting to watch. Watching what they do at cornerback. Jeremy Lane, I think, is going to be the number 2 cornerback, and I think he'll start on the right side in the base set, but he'll slide in at nickel. So who becomes the outside corner? Is it Deshaun Shedd? Is it going to be Thurl Simon? There's just interesting stuff all throughout the roster. The back of the wide receiver depth, the running back rotation. There's a lot to look for this training camp.
You mentioned the battle to replace Bruce Irvin, Mike Morgan being in there, as well as Cassius Marsh and Kevin Pierre-Louis and Eric Pinkins. Is there, one of the guys is one of the difficult things with this team and this defense and replacing Bruce Irvin and sort of understanding what the positions are in Pete Carroll's defense and the guys that they've brought in. Do you see Chris Clemens or Brandon Browner playing a part in that battle for the Sam linebacker, or are they definitely going to be a defensive back and a defensive end, respectively?
I see them playing into it. Browner more than I see Clemens. But I see them playing – if Browner figures into the race, I think it's because they use him as sort of a hybrid in-the-box safety type. We play with 2 true linebackers on the field in KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner. I don't think that he'll be a factor in the traditional like Sam role, but I think what you could see is that he comes in as this kind of in-the-box safety, a good run supporter, a guy who can match up with tight ends in the passing game, which is something they do like their linebackers to be able to do in coverage, who could buzz the flats, that type of thing. And that he sort of works and incorporates some of those roles of Sam linebacker into his position. I think if we're looking at like a 1-for-1 trade-off, though, that's not going to be from either of those guys. I think it's going to be from one of the four guys competing for the spot right now, because that position requires somebody to do so many things well, and to be really stout up front and drop into coverage and all that stuff. I don't know that a defensive end like Chris Clemens or Leo type could really transition into that in the coverage aspect. I don't know that Brandon Browner could transition as a edge setting run defender. So it's going to be super interesting though, because there are, with the guys they have there and the way that they might kind of alter this defense, there's a ton of different combos you could see working out. And there's not, like I said, there's not like one real favorite there. So that to me is going to be the most interesting spot to watch, I think, from the first day of camp on. And we'll just kind of see if we get a feel for what they're doing as camp goes on.
Yeah, and speaking of ad nauseum, other storylines that have been going on all year, Jimmy Graham and Thomas Rawls, two guys that suffered devastating injuries last year, but the talk has been more recently that they'll both be ready by week 1. How much should we expect to see Thomas Rawls or Jimmy Graham in the preseason or in training camp?
We'll see them some in training camp, but I don't think either will be ready to play right away. John Schneider told us as much today, that neither one of them is probably going to suit up on Saturday for the first day, and they're still deciding whether or not they're going to be on the PUP list to start camp here. And if they do that, it gives them a little more time to get well. But it does call into question what their availability might be like for the start of the regular season. So I don't know. I think they're going to play it safe with these guys. These are two really serious injuries. And specifically with Rawls, the fact that we didn't see him really progress, like a lot of us thought he might through the spring. Because at first, I don't think any of us really understood how severe his kind of foot and ankle thing was. But the fact that he's been really sidelined and not able to do any amount of work with the team during the offseason, I think gives you an indication of how safe they're playing with him, because they really don't want to put this guy in a position where he's going to get re-injured. They're going to try to rely on him a lot in the running game with Marshawn Lynch moving on, obviously, and put him in the best position to succeed. So I don't think that they're super worried about him getting a ton of touches in the preseason. They know what he can do. They saw that last year, and they'll try and take it easy. And same with Graham. It probably makes a bigger difference for Graham to get in there and get some more reps, because he did have sort of limited reps in with the team last year, and he was such a different kind of player than we'd seen before on that team, that I think any opportunity for him to get on the field with Russell Wilson and to kind of start working out his routes and how he's going to fit in the offense, it would be a bigger deal than Thomas Rawls, who they're just going to hand the ball to and let him go, and who showed the ability to do that, as an untested rookie last year. So I think we'll see them both at some point during the preseason, but I wouldn't expect to see tons of them during the preseason.
One of the interesting things too about the preseason will be, obviously with the loss of Tavares Jackson, or, at least not re-signing him, and then his subsequent arrest, that could keep him away from the team and the NFL, is the fact that in past years, Russell Wilson could, and obviously will not be playing a lot in the preseason, except for, maybe a little bit of warm-ups in the game 3, which means, that Trevone Boykin and Jake Heaps are the only other 2 quarterbacks signed to the roster. And when they're sort of evaluating who's going to be the 5th and potentially 6th receiver out of this group of Kenny Lawler and Kason Williams and Kevin Smith and the other guys, it's sort of difficult maybe to evaluate those guys without a veteran, or if there's going to be, okay, we're going to see 3/4 of Boykin and 1/4 of Heaps, or a half of each, or maybe a full game from Boykin. And if he's not ready yet, do you expect them to go out there and look for veteran quarterbacks to perhaps give these guys the other guys that they're evaluating? Because the quarterback's such an important piece to the puzzle that if he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, no offense to Boykin or Heaps, but there's just really untested.
Yeah.
It's just going to drag down everybody else. Do you see them making any adjustments at quarterback, or are we going to really find out who these other two quarterbacks are?
Well, that's another thing that we asked Schneider about today was, are you keeping veteran quarterbacks sort of your radar or your antenna up for a veteran? And he said they are, but they're not doing it to the exclusion of like any other position group. They're kind of handling it as they would any other position. So it is, though, like it's a little disconcerting, I imagine, for fans to look on that depth chart and see an undrafted rookie and then an undrafted second-year guy who hardly played in college as the only options behind Russell Wilson. And I do think it does play into the evaluation process, because you're right. When there's a vet in there, when you see Tavares Jackson out in the preseason game and he's throwing to these, second and third team guys, it's easier to kind of project what they would do if pushed into action. When you see a guy who's just breaking in and trying to get through a preseason game for the first time, I don't know how much you can put into what the other players around him are doing in that game, or it certainly at least complicates it. That being said, John Schneider said today he thought if Trevon Boykin hadn't had that run-in with the law at the end of his senior year, he thought he was a third to fifth round quarterback coming out of TCU. So he's high on him. They like what he did in this offseason. They liked his arm strength. They liked his athleticism. They liked the way that he came in and started learning from Russell Wilson right away. So they're high on him. They think, a lot of him. It just seems like a lot to hand a guy in his first year, as an undrafted player. But we'll see. I think, a guy like Nick Foles gets released, and you can't help but think, like, would he be a fit? But the one thing they like about Boykin is that they have some stylistic similarities with Russell Wilson. He can run on the move. He can evade tacklers in the backfield. He does have a good arm, and maybe they like having the consistency and style there, and they want to go with that. So it's another position that will be very interesting to watch throughout the preseason.
It seems like one of the wild cards on the Seahawks right now, because we talk about Graham and Rawls coming back from injury. Thurl Simon is a guy that's also could be starting, coming back from, missing two of his first three seasons. And I mean, we do talk about Paul Richardson, but it seems like it's really not at the level that you might expect to talk about a guy who was, mid-second round pick and towards the end of his rookie year was really coming on strong. And now you look at it and say that they've added Tyler Lockett, and he's looking like a great receiver. Doug Baldwin just had a breakout season. They added Jimmy Graham, and within that time frame between Paul Richardson tearing his ACL, and even Jermaine Kearse got a new contract, and he's perhaps become a more complete receiver. That's and all that kind of stuff. And in all this case, plus the way that Russell Wilson's options are going to go with CJ Prosise and Nick Vanett, it's like there's so many new things happening that where does Paul Richardson fit is going to be a question. But at the same time, you could look at it and still say that Paul Richardson has the highest ceiling of any receiver on the team. How has he looked in the offseason in the summer, and how do you expect him to fit in over the next few weeks?
He looked good in the offseason, but he was banged up again too. I think in minicamp we saw him the first day. He looked really good, was catching everything his way, was really one of the standouts from the offensive sessions, from the 11-on-11 sessions rather. And then he kind of pulled up with a little hamstring thing, and we didn't see him a lot the next 2 days of minicamp, which is like, that's par for the course for Paul Richardson, right? Kind of teases you with his talent and then can't stay on the field. So, yeah, it's a big deal for him. This whole offseason is a big deal because if he stays healthy, he can be that kind of receiver that gives them an element of speed on the outside and better size than Tyler Lockett. They don't really have another guy like him if he's healthy and if he can stay on the field. But that is a huge if at this point, and I don't think any of us know that he has the capability to really stay on the field yet. That said, he was one of the guys who was with Russell Wilson all offseason. It seemed like anytime you saw Wilson having a throwing session, Richardson was there. Anytime that there was one of those kind of camps where the receivers and stuff would get together, Richardson was there and really stood out. So season for him. I think he knew it too going in. I think that he is, going to, make the most of this opportunity, because he knows that 2 injury-plagued seasons into the league, you don't get that many chances in the NFL. And so he'll be looking to, I think, make up for lost time, and we'll just see if he can stay on the field.
It can be difficult to talk about the Seahawks sometimes and not sound like a homer right now, because you're saying like, hey, this is a really good team. And we think that some of these players are going to either come in and be really good or get better and be amazing. And we just say that because I'm saying it again. A lot of people talking about Frank Clark and how he could go to this next level in his second season. To do that in the middle of a time when they're working on, potentially extending Michael Bennett at some point this year or next year. And Cliff Averill is still under contract, and he's perhaps an underrated pass rusher still. Where do you see how do they get more work for Frank Clark this year if they're not using him to replace Bruce Irvin? Is Frank Clark going to play more, or do they just expect him to do more?
I think you'll see him a lot as a pass rusher in like nickel and dime packages, and they're going to play a lot of nickel. They're going to play a lot of nickel. But he's going to give them, they had Bruce Irvin in as a nickel pass rusher for a lot of the last couple of years, and they kicked Michael Bennett inside. And I think that's what you'll see Clark do, is he'll come in, he'll take over Irvin's pass rushing role. And that's something that he's really comfortable with. That's something that he really wants to do. He describes himself as a pass rusher when you ask him his position. And so I think we'll see now if he can, match or possibly, you'd hope that he could even exceed some of the production that you saw from Bruce Irvin, although Bruce Irvin turned into a really good all-around player in his 4 years here. So I think you're going to see a lot of him. I think you're going to see them kind of quit messing with trying to bump him inside as a D tackle on passing downs. I think they saw enough of that to realize that's not his strength, is being put in there where he's got 2 guys who can potentially handle him and he has to kind of work his way through traffic. I think they like his speed and power, and that he's more able to show that on the outside as a pass rusher. So you'll see a lot of that. And then, what that means for him as far as like a base package player, I don't know that he has a spot right now. But maybe it does mean that you get to spell Michael Bennett or Cliff Averill a little bit more. Those guys have played a lot of football the last couple of years, and they are not young players anymore. And so maybe you see them get a little bit of a break, and you see them be able to, be spelled by a guy who comes in and has a huge upside, as much talent, I think, as any defensive lineman on the team. So, that would be good too, just to kind of get that guy in the mix and to make sure that the players like Bennett and Averill, who make such an impact, are able to get a blow every now and then.
I want to talk a little bit about the fringe players, perhaps, or the new players. Are there any first-year players that have been disappointments so far, either to the team or to the media watching and what they've seen through rookie mini camps and just regular mini camp? Any of the rookies and first-year guys been disappointing so far?
Well, the one that comes to mind is Jaron Reed, but it's not fair exactly, because in minicamp and OTAs, when it's not full contact and these guys are only wearing, helmets, it's really hard for an interior lineman to make a splash. That said, I did notice Quentin Jefferson more than I noticed Jaron Reed as far as a disruptive presence on the line. And Quentin Jefferson was definitely a guy who they moved around a lot. They had him on end, they had him inside, and you could see that they have plans for him maybe to try and approximate a Michael Bennett role. Reed was all inside, and again, because you're just watching guys sort of shadow boxing, but let's just say he didn't do anything that made me think he could be like a real disruptive pass rusher from the inside, which is something he thinks he has in his game. But I know it's sort of a knock on him coming out of Alabama, that maybe he wasn't a guy who could do that. He was just a run stuffer. And frankly, if that's all he can do, that's fine. They need that. They need an elite interior run stuffer. But it was hard to display that during the off season.
That's interesting. Not what I expected necessarily, but that's great. I like to hear. I don't like to hear that maybe he's been a little slow, but I do like to hear that. I don't know, inside info. I don't know.
When he wins
especially
defensive
like
rookie
with
of the year, when he wins
yeah,
defensive rookie of the year, you can play that again, and just it'll show that I have no
it's
idea what's going on.
and it's positive for Quentin Jefferson, which I did not expect either. So, and nothing against Quentin Jefferson, but it's like sometimes you do get those guys where they were drafted much later and they just outplay the guy at the same position, and we'll see. They're like you say, they still have to put pads on. And with training camp, is that allowed to be full contact right away?
That's a good question. Actually, I don't know the answer right off the top of my head because it's been a year.
Oh yeah, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's totally fine. But I do think that they work their way into it. I think that Saturday you'll see some more like shell stuff, and then they'll put on full pads here coming up. Maybe in the second week. That sounds about right.
Are there any guys? Because I mean, I've now sort of for field goals previewed every position in some form, and it's interesting when you get down. I realize there's going to be names that I totally dismissed that are going to just like shine, over the next few weeks, and other guys that'll be like, oh yeah, he's fine to make the team, and then he's not. Is there any? Are there any names, maybe one or two names that we don't talk about as much that could be the Thomas Rawls of this year, the guys that we won't talk about until suddenly 2-3 weeks into the preseason, it's like, I actually think this guy's going to make the team and so's not. Who are some of the guys and the names that you think fans are going to hear a lot more of over the next month?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have a really good answer for you, though, because the more I looked at it, the places where this roster is stacked are like the places where they added a lot of undrafted guys. Like I look at the secondary, right? You see a guy like Tyvis Powell from Ohio State, who certainly looks the part and is a big dude. I think he's like 6'4", 220, huge guy. You can kind of see Cam Chancellor in him a little bit, and he plays the same position. You think maybe this is a guy who could come in and develop into, a really big contributor there. But then you look at the depth around him and you see, okay, not only do you have Cam Chancellor, but you've got a guy like Kelsey McRae, who played really well in relief of Chancellor at strong safety, and then was running as the number 2 free safety this offseason. So is a versatile guy. And you've got a guy like Deshaun Shedd, who can play basically any position in the secondary. So it's going to be tough for these guys. There's a lot of undrafted guys in the secondary who look interesting. My guy DeAndre Elliott from Colorado State is the only corner, I think. But you look at the guys that he would have to beat out for a roster spot, and it is daunting. There are going to be a lot of people, established guys, in that room. So I don't know if I have a good name for you. Who's going to jump out? I guess the one guy would be Jefferson, even though he's not a free agent. He is kind of a late round pick. But I think they like him a lot, and I think they see him as somebody who can come in and play a couple of different roles for them. They asked him to drop some weight, I believe, after minicamp based on some of the social media posts. And to me, that says a role for him where he could be a hybrid guy. You forget Michael Bennett wasn't Michael Bennett coming out of school. He was an undrafted guy. Maybe they see something in Quentin Jefferson that reminds him of Bennett, and they go from there. So he's the one guy who I think just jumped out to me as far as, they're giving him a lot of reps, and he seems to be handling it, and they're moving him around a lot, and maybe there's a spot for him, a bigger role than I would have anticipated.
I think that's fair. I think Quentin Jefferson does sort of get forgotten about with the class, especially, drafting Alex Collins, who's a running back in the 5th round, and Zach Brooks, who's a running back in the 7th round, and the center that everyone was expecting in the 6th round. It sort of gets lost in the shuffle that they did trade back to the 5th round to get Quentin Jefferson. And when you've taken Jaron Reed in the 2nd round, and everyone is so excited about that defensive tackle, you do sort of forget that Quentin Jefferson was drafted by this team. But the 5th, all these guys, it's been harder and harder to project because there's been a lot of good 5th round picks for the Seahawks and a lot of bad ones. So we'll see which way it goes. And also another forgotten guy, perhaps, just because he was, I think, a little bit of a surprise, and also just plays inside interior line, is Reese Adiyambo. Any sort of thoughts on Adiyambo's offseason so far, and whether or not is he a lock to be a backup lineman this year?
I think he is.
I think you're breaking up a little bit. Oh, that's better.
This is what happens when you do from the mean streets of Ballard. I think they really do like and being attacked courses. Bo is slotted in behind him at left guard, and he's a guy who played tackle in school, but I think they've always seen him as a guy who can kick inside, and so I think he's sort of buried in that spot right now. That said, the long-term play for him could be on the opposite side if they do think that Jermaine Ifedi can come in at guard and then kick out to tackle, next year or the year after. Then that opens up a starting guard spot. But I think they like him. It's been hard to tell, obviously. Line play is just so difficult to try and evaluate in the offseason. But I don't think I ever saw him take first-team reps for whatever that's worth. I don't think that he was a guy who went above Lewinsky at all. So I think that tells you a little bit about the pecking order there.
Gotcha. Well, I think you mentioned Tyvis Powell. Just a couple other guys to mention. You talked about Thorold Simon and Jeremy Lane. Sort of, do you think that that's going to be the opposite Richard Sherman? It's going to be Jeremy Lane in the base, and then Simon moving out for the nickel. And you sort of mentioned that maybe Simon hasn't necessarily won that job, but do you think that there's really a good competition there for Simon on the outside? Is there anyone else like Ty Smith or Marcus Burley that could push him for that job?
Yeah, I think the guys to watch there would be Smith. Dejon Shed, I think, is another guy who, too, when he played outside last year, he played pretty well. And so I know they like him and they really trust Shed wherever they play him there. So there's nobody who has the upside of Simon, though, I will say. Like, that guy just looks the part when you see him out in the field. He just looks like a Seahawks corner. He's long, he's tall, he's a big guy, he's aggressive. He had some really good moments during the off season, and then he had a couple of like real knucklehead moments, which again is sort of par for the course with him so far. And he's another guy who just needs to stay on the field. But man, if he really developed into a solid kind of number 2 outside corner for them, I think it would be a huge bonus for what they're looking for, because then Jeremy Lane's a great outside corner. Like, he's a good outside corner. He's a great slot corner. And if they could just sort of exclusively use him there, I think they'd be thrilled. And then have a guy like Simon who, could potentially be another Byron Maxwell outside or somebody even with more kind of innate athleticism there. So, I don't know. He has to stay healthy and he has to really keep his cool on the practice field. We saw one incident with him in the off season where he was, how should I say this, a little bit overly familiar with one of his offensive teammates during 11-on-11s and got in trouble with the coaching staff a little bit from that. And if he kind of turns it on though and gets it together, he could be a really exciting player for them.
Steven, we're going to wrap it up. Last, sort of topic. Just 2 weeks from this Saturday, they'll open up the preseason against the Kansas City Chiefs in Kansas City at 1:30 Saturday, August 13th. Obviously, what happens in the next 2 weeks in training camp will say a lot, but what will you most be looking for in that week 1 preseason game in terms of maybe starters or players to watch? What do you think are maybe a couple positions or players that you're most looking forward to seeing on August 13th?
I think it'll be interesting to see who kind of lines up with the offensive line, but since we've talked about that ad nauseum, the other thing will be the running back rotation. You mentioned Alex Collins before. He's a guy who I think potentially could play a pretty big role in his rookie season if he shows he has the ability to hold on to the ball. And if he comes in there and hits the holes like he was hitting them in the offseason, he'll be fun to watch. He's physical, he's fast, he's got some really deceptive kind of lateral movement for a guy who's kind of as big as he is. But he has a real chance to, I think, move past Christian Michael on this depth chart if he just can show the ability to hang on to the ball. So they'll give these guys, I think, extended work in the preseason because I think they really want to see what they have in that running back rotation. And so he's the guy I think I would kind of zero in on for that first game.
All right. That's I love Alex Collins. Do you think that my thought is they want all of the running backs to play well, obviously, but I think they want all of the running backs to play well enough to perhaps trade Christian Michael for the second year in a row. Do you think that Alex Collins playing well sort of puts Michael back in a position to not make the team again?
Could be. It could be. It also could depend on how a guy like Zach Brooks plays, because we didn't see a lot of him in the offseason because he was a little banged up. But, if they feel like they have a guy like Brooks who they could maybe stash on the practice squad and then feel comfortable going to if they needed to later in the year, then, I could totally see them moving on from Michael again.
All right. Stephen Cohen, Seattle PI. What's your Twitter handle?
S Cohen PI.
At S Cohen PI. Is there, and I'm sure you'll have daily coverage of training camp on seattlepi.com.
Yep, starting on Saturday. We'll be there.
Starting on Saturday. So there it is. Again, this is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. I'm Kenneth Arthur of Field Goals. You can find all of that stuff on Twitter and the internet, just like you found this podcast. So thank you very much for listening to the show. Thank you, Stephen, for joining me once again. And that's it. Enjoy your seaside walks. Goodbye.